Throughout time, magazines have played an important role in American news, continuing to be popular despite advancement in technology. However, this doesn't mean they haven't adapted with the times. American magazines and their publications have seen a huge change over the years of their existence, especially when it comes to how they're published. Digital magazines have become more popular today, but this was not always the case. Another big change in magazine history was splitting off into different kinds. Instead of having one type of magazine trying to appeal to everyone, 3 main types of magazines were developed with focused areas and targeted audience. These were popular culture, news, and scholarly. News magazines are exactly what they sound like. They analyze and even break down news stories. Some examples are Time Magazine, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report. These were the first kinds of magazines. Pop culture magazines cover anything from celebrity gossip to the latest fashion trends. These were developed later on in their history, but the first was developed in 1908. Some examples are Vanity Fair, Cosmopolitan, and People. Scholarly magazines tend to be more of a collection of articles from a wide range of qualified people. Some of these magazines have a focused topic that their articles mainly cover, but some also do not have a set topic and let their writers write about their own chosen one. These actually stem off of news magazines, as the two were blended together until the early 1900s. Some types of scholarly articles are National Geographic, Academic Exchange Quarterly, and the American Research Journal. Magazines have a huge influence on today's society. It is actually one of the main forms of media referenced when mentioning America's culture. Some examples are magazines' increased use of clothing ads using models have a direct correlation with a spike in eating disorders in our youth. Also, although many people believe that journalists are unbiased, that is not always the case. Magazine article writers have quite the influence on readers when forming their opinion, especially if the issue is written about is politics. The first magazines weren't as fancy as the ones today. Their target audience was anyone who could read. It was an age of readers since neither television or radio had been invented yet. Also, the articles were much longer. It was usual for an article to be about the length of a novel and be published in a magazine as a series. Also, during this time, magazine writers were having a huge effect on politics and politicians. Some writers exposed political corruption, called muckrakers, and they had a huge effect on the voters, politicians, and our democracy as a whole. One specific example was Ida Tarbell's coverage of Standard Oil's monopoly. She exposed their malpractices and illegal business tactics. The articles were then turned into a book called The History of Standard Oil in 1904. She was one of the most influential muckrakers and is considered one of the pioneers of investigative journalism. The first news magazine was Time, which was created in 1923 by Henry Luce and Brighton Hayden. The two worked together on the Yale Daily News and decided to work together on a magazine. Hayden was considered carefree and more laid back, and when he saw Time as an important news outlet, he decided it was another opportunity to report on pop culture. The first issue was published on March 3, 1923. It originally cost 15 cents. The equivalent of that in today's currency is $2.08. Magazines are different than any other type of media. Magazines began with very few people and soon became controlled by a select few. Henry Luce founded Time in 1923 and began his empire. Soon, Fortune was created in 1930. After he created the 2 stable magazines, he looked forward and purchased Life, and created a photo magazine out of it. Luce retired as editor-in-chief of all of his publications and decided to move on. Others took over, and Time Incorporated moved on as well. Andrew Haskell is credited with creating the popular magazine Time, Inc., called People. The golden age of magazines was when the Great Depression hit the United States in the 1930s. It was expected that magazines would see a decline because they're commonly seen as a luxury. However, magazines began to thrive even more, despite the radio popping up as a news competitor. In 1936, Henry Luce purchased Life magazine and turned it into a photo magazine. Magazines such as Time, Fortune, and National Geographic were dominating the business in the 30s. Magazines also began targeting their audience in this time. Fortune was aimed towards the upper class, while magazines like Life were focused more towards the people. In the 1940s, photo magazines started to rise. With World War II at its beginning, the magazine Life saw their time to shine. Life focused mainly on advertising, showing off, and documenting the war. It showed Americans what the war was really like. All media was focused on the war at that time. In the 1950s, television became the predominant source of news in households. Magazines saw their numbers drop from their circulation, so targeting started back up again. Magazines started focusing on certain groups to attract that certain group alone. They started focusing on certain subjects, eventually becoming 3 separate groups: scholarly, trade or business magazines, and popular magazines. For example, the Saturday Night Evening Post started up and began focusing more on pop culture, delving into the lives of regular Americans. With conformity at its peak, Saturday Evening Post rivaled itself with other major competitors. Today, magazine publications still have physical copies, but the start of online publications have increased drastically over the past 5 years. Magazines have also seen big changes in not only the way they're published, but what they cover and how they make their profit. Since the 1950s, magazines have gotten most of their money from advertisements instead of from subscriptions and copies sold. Since it's becoming more and more popular for readers to be subscribed online, magazine articles are becoming shorter than they were in early history. However, the type of magazines can also dictate, for example, a scholarly article will most likely be much longer than a popular culture one. Other types of magazines were being created and published during this time as well, such as People magazine. People focused predominantly on celebrity life and human interests. Arthur Turner created the first fashion magazine called Vogue in 1892. However, in 1909, Condé Montrose Nast purchased it and turned it into the very first magazine empire. Condé Montrose Nast created Condé Nast Publications, which currently runs the popular culture magazines Vogue, Vanity Fair, Glamour, and The New Yorker. Rupert Murdoch founded Star magazine in 1974, which focused primarily on celebrity life, pop culture, and entertainment. The internet was another huge form of media that affected magazines, forcing another change. Instead of staying with the old, magazines began going online. Adding subscription-based online magazines expanded magazines to their next generation of people in the 2000s. The newest strategy they have are selling premium spots for advertisers and offering incentives to subscribing to their publication. So far, magazines are back on the rise. Magazines will never die out. They have gone through 2 big transformations since their creation and are still surviving today just as big as they were. Despite how big it is, though, magazines are most likely going to go through another big change in the near future to keep up with technology. No matter what this change is, magazines will continue to adapt and survive. They'll continue to be successful in the media after all this change.